In July 2015, Loretta Jackson, a 48-year-old woman living in Tampa, Florida, found herself immersed in the familiar rhythm of her daily life. She was married to Edward Jackson, the pastor of a local Baptist church, and together they had raised 3 children who had long since moved out to start their own lives. For nearly 2 decades, 18 years, to be exact, Loretta had stood by Edward's side as he led his congregation with a steady hand. She had taken on her own roles within the church, directing the choir with a gentle but firm touch, organizing charity luncheons that filled the community hall with the clatter of plates and the hum of grateful voices, and offering quiet support to her husband whenever he needed it. Their home sat on a modest plot near the bay, a simple but welcoming place where the salty tang of the Gulf mingled with the faint sweetness of blooming magnolias carried on the humid breeze. The summer heat had settled over Tampa like a thick blanket, pressing down on the city with unrelenting force. Loretta often stood on the porch in the early mornings, watching the sun rise over the water, its golden light shimmering across the surface before the day's humidity took hold. Inside, the house stayed cool enough thanks to the whirring ceiling fans and the occasional breeze that slipped through the open windows. She kept the place tidy, the wooden floors polished to a soft shine, the kitchen stocked with jars of homemade preserves she'd put up in the spring. It was a life she had built with care, one that felt steady and predictable, rooted in faith and routine. But over the past few months, something had shifted. Loretta had begun to notice a change in Edward, subtle at first, but growing harder to ignore as the weeks wore on. He had always been a busy man, his days filled with sermons, counseling sessions, and visits to the sick or grieving members of their flock. Yet lately, his absences had stretched longer than usual. He would leave the house with little explanation, returning late with a distracted air about him. When she asked where he'd been, his answers came vague and clipped, brushed off with a wave of his hand or a tired sigh. Then there were the phone calls, short, hushed exchanges that came in the dead of night, rousing her from sleep as Edward slipped out of bed to take them in the hallway. She'd lie there, eyes tracing the shadows on the ceiling, listening to the low murmur of his voice through the walls, unable to make out the words. Loretta told herself it was nothing more than exhaustion. Edward carried the weight of the church on his shoulders, a burden that had only grown heavier with time. The congregation had swelled in recent years, drawing new faces to the pews, and with them came new demands, more souls to shepherd, more problems to solve. She convinced herself that his distance was a passing phase, a season of strain that would ease once the summer heat broke and the pace of life slowed. Still, a quiet unease took root in her chest, a nagging sensation she couldn't quite shake, like a splinter lodged too deep to pull free. Adding to her unease was a physical discomfort that had crept up on her in recent weeks. It started as a faint ache low in her abdomen, a dull twinge that came and went with no pattern she could discern. At first, she dismissed it as a product of the oppressive weather. July in Tampa was a trial for anyone, with its sticky air and temperatures that climbed into the high 90s by noon. She was no stranger to the toll the heat could take, the way it sapped her energy and left her feeling sluggish. Or perhaps it was her age, she reasoned. At 48, her body wasn't as resilient as it once had been. She ignored the pain as best she could, pushing through her chores and church duties with the same determination that had carried her through 18 years of marriage. She swept the porch, rehearsed hymns with the choir, and smiled through the sweat beading on her forehead, telling herself it would pass. Yet as the days stretched on, the ache lingered, a quiet companion that shadowed her through the sweltering summer. She kept it to herself, not wanting to trouble Edward when he already seemed so preoccupied. In the mornings, she'd stand at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee and watching the gulls wheel over the bay, her hand resting lightly on her stomach as if she could will the discomfort away. The house buzzed with the small sounds of life, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards under her feet, but beneath it all, Loretta felt the first stirrings of something unsettled, a premonition she couldn't name. For now, she held fast to the routines that had always anchored her, trusting they would see her through whatever lay ahead. The ache that had shadowed Loretta for weeks grew sharper as July wore on, no longer a fleeting discomfort but a piercing pain that stabbed at her insides with increasing insistence. It struck hardest at night, pulling her from restless sleep with jolts that left her clutching the sheets, her breath shallow in the humid darkness. She lay awake in the small hours, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily overhead, its blades cutting through the stillness, while Edward slept soundly beside her, oblivious to her struggle. The pain had become too persistent to ignore, a nagging force that gnawed at her resolve until she could no longer dismiss it as a quirk of the weather or a sign of creeping age. She decided she had to see a doctor, though the thought of it tightened her chest with a mix of dread and reluctance. She chose not to tell Edward about her plan. He had been consumed lately with preparations for a grand Sunday service, a special event meant to mark the church's anniversary and draw the congregation together in celebration. His days were filled with meetings, his evenings spent hunched over sermon notes at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. Loretta saw the strain in the lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching, and she didn't want to add to his burdens. She told herself she could handle this quietly, slip away to the clinic and return with answers before he even noticed she'd been gone. So one morning, after he left for the church, she drove herself across town, the steering wheel slick under her palms from the heat and her own nervous sweat. The clinic in Tampa sat low and unassuming, its beige walls baking under the relentless sun. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, filled with the steady hum of air conditioners that battled the Florida humidity and the sharp scent of antiseptic that clung to everything. Loretta sat in the waiting room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor as she tried to steady her breathing. When her name was called, she followed a nurse down a narrow hallway to an examination room, where the doctor, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and wire-rimmed glasses, greeted her with a nod. He asked her questions about the pain, jotting notes on a clipboard as she described its rhythm and intensity, her voice low and hesitant. Then came the examination, a routine procedure that turned anything but routine when the doctor's expression shifted from professional curiosity to something more guarded. He stepped back, his gloved hand still poised, and took a moment before speaking. What he found inside her defied comprehension, a foreign object, a used condom, lodged where it had no business being. Blood tests confirmed an infection, the kind that suggested more than just an isolated incident. The words hit Loretta like a physical blow, draining the color from her face and leaving her ears ringing as if the room had tilted beneath her. She sat frozen on the exam table, the paper crinkling under her trembling hands, her mind a chaotic swirl of disbelief and confusion. The doctor explained it carefully, his tone measured and clinical, but she barely registered the details, something about immediate treatment, follow-up tests, questions she couldn't answer. When he finished, he offered her a moment alone, and she nodded mutely, staring at the wall as he slipped out of the room. The drive home passed in a haze. The streets of Tampa blurred past her windshield, the palm trees and strip malls melting into a smear of green and concrete under the midday glare. She gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles aching, trying to piece together how this could have happened, how something so unthinkable had invaded her body and her life. By the time she pulled into the driveway, her blouse clung to her back with sweat, and her thoughts were a tangled knot she couldn't unravel. She sat in the car for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, before forcing herself to step out into the oppressive heat and walk into the house. Edward was home when she entered, his presence unexpected. He sat in the living room, flipping through a hymnal, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as she crossed the threshold, and his eyes narrowed at the sight of her pallor, the way her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. He set the book aside and stood, crossing the room with a purpose that made her stomach twist. He asked her what was wrong, his voice edged with concern, but Loretta brushed it off with a weak wave of her hand. She muttered something about feeling under the weather, the heat getting to her, anything to avoid the truth clawing at her throat. She couldn't bring herself to tell him, not yet, not when she didn't understand it herself, not when the mere thought of saying it aloud threatened to shatter the fragile peace they'd maintained for so long. He pressed her, his insistence gentle but firm, but she turned away, retreating to the kitchen under the pretense of needing water, her heart pounding against her ribs. As she stood at the sink, filling a glass with shaking hands, whispers from the church crept into her mind. She'd heard them before, faint murmurs passed between the pews, rumors about Edward and a new parishioner, a young widow named Cheryl who had joined the congregation a few months back. The woman had a quiet beauty and a tragic story that drew sympathy, and lately, people had noticed how often Edward lingered in her company after services, how he'd been seen driving her home on more than one occasion. Loretta had dismissed it as idle gossip, the kind that flourished in small communities with too much time and too little to talk about. But now, standing in the dim light of her kitchen, the rumors took on a darker shade, feeding the doubt that gnawed at her alongside the doctor's impossible revelation. She set the glass down untouched, her fingers curling into fists, and wondered how long she could keep this shadow from breaking into the open. The day had dragged on with a sluggish weight, each hour soaked in the oppressive heat that clung to Tampa like a second skin. By evening, Loretta and Edward found themselves alone in the living room, the house settling into a quiet that felt heavy and expectant. Outside, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple, but the air remained thick and stagnant, pressing against the windows with no hint of relief. The ceiling fan whirred above them, its blade slicing through the humidity in a futile attempt to stir the stillness, while a single lamp cast a warm, dim glow across the room. Loretta sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her body tense with the secret she'd carried since morning. Edward sprawled in the armchair across from her, his legs stretched out, his fingers tapping absently on the armrest, his mind still half occupied with the day's demands. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The weight of the doctor's words had grown unbearable, a pressure that built inside her chest until it threatened to burst. She took a steadying breath and began to speak, her voice low and halting as she recounted her visit to the clinic. She described the examination, the doctor's discovery of the used condom, the infection that followed, each detail spilling out like shards of glass she couldn't keep contained. Edward listened in silence, his posture stiffening with every word. His hands stopped their restless movement, curling into fists that rested heavily on the arms of the chair. His face hardened, the lines around his mouth deepening, his eyes narrowing into slits as he stared at her, unblinking. When she finished, the room fell into a stillness so profound it seemed the air itself held its breath. He rose abruptly, the chair creaking under the sudden shift of his weight. His fists remained clenched at his sides as he towered over her, his shadow stretching across the floor. He accused her of infidelity, his certainty cutting through the space between them like a blade. He didn't ask for explanations or entertain the possibility of misunderstanding. His mind had seized on betrayal as the only truth, and he clung to it with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. Loretta recoiled, stunned by the venom in his reaction. She had expected shock, perhaps anger, but not this immediate, unshakable conviction that she had strayed. Her own confusion and fear surged to the surface, mingling with a sudden, sharp indignation. She pushed herself to her feet, her hands trembling as she faced him, and threw the rumors about Cheryl back at him, her words fueled by the whispers she tried so hard to ignore. The ones about his late-night drives with the widow, the ones the church elders had let slip in hushed tones. The air between them crackled with tension, their voices rising in a jagged crescendo that drowned out the hum of the fan. Old wounds tore open, grievances buried for years clawing their way into the light. Loretta's hurt over Edward's unexplained absences, his evasiveness, his detachment, all of it poured out in a rush, her restraint crumbling under the weight of the day's revelations. Edward's fury fed on her defiance, his own guilt and suspicion twisting into a storm he couldn't control. He took a step closer, his chest heaving, and she matched him by stepping back, their movements a tense dance across the worn rug. The argument spiraled, each accusation building on the last, until it reached a breaking point neither could pull back from. In a flash of rage, Edward lunged forward, his hands shooting out to grab her shoulders. His fingers dug into her flesh, his grip tight and unyielding as he shook her, demanding she name the man he was certain she'd betrayed him with. His strength overwhelmed her, his knuckles whitening as he held her in place, his face contorted with a mix of anger and desperation. Loretta's breath caught, her body jolting under his grasp. She twisted against him, her arms flailing as she fought to break free, her feet sliding on the slick floor. She managed to wrench herself loose, stumbling backward toward the kitchen, her heart pounding in her ears. Her retreat was clumsy, her balance thrown by panic and the uneven footing of the room's threshold. Her heel caught the leg of a chair, its wooden frame scraping against the tiles as it shifted under her weight. She flailed, her arms reaching for something to steady herself, but there was nothing within grasp. Her momentum carried her back, and she crashed into the edge of the kitchen table with a force that reverberated through her frame. The impact drove the air from her lungs, a dull thud echoing in the small space as her head snapped back against the table's sharp corner. Pain exploded behind her eyes, a blinding flash that faded into darkness as she crumpled to the floor. Her body landed in a heap, one arm twisted beneath her, her leg splayed at an awkward angle. A thin trickle of blood seeped from where her head had struck, pooling slowly on the linoleum, its edges spreading like tendrils in the dim light. Edward stood rooted to the spot, his hands still outstretched, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The fury that had driven him drained away in an instant, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. He stared down at her motionless form, her chest still, her eyes half open but unseeing. The room seemed to close in around him, the hum of the fan a distant drone beneath the roar of his own pulse. He took a tentative step forward, then stopped, his hands falling limp at his sides. The weight of what he'd done settled over him, a suffocating truth he couldn't unmake. Loretta lay there, silent and still, and Edward understood, with a clarity that cut deeper than any anger, that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. The blood spread across the kitchen linoleum in a slow, deliberate crawl, its dark edges blending with the faint brown stains of coffee Loretta had spilled that morning and never quite cleaned up. Edward stood over her, his feet planted on the tiles, his body rigid with a terror that rooted him in place. The sight of her lifeless form, her chest still, her eyes glassy and fixed on nothing, bore into him, each detail sharpening the reality he couldn't escape. Her head rested at an odd angle against the table's edge, a thin stream of crimson trickling from the point of impact, matting her hair and pooling beneath her. His hands trembled at his sides, the adrenaline that had fueled his rage now replaced by a cold, hollow panic that clawed at his insides. He understood she was gone, the finality of it sinking in like a stone dropped into deep water. His mind raced, a chaotic flood of images flashing before him, the church pews filled with faces he'd preached to for years, his children's accusing stares, a courtroom gavel slamming down, the shame of a pastor undone by his own hand. The life he'd built, the reputation he'd guarded so fiercely, teetered on the edge of ruin. Calling the police was the logical step, the right one, but the thought choked him. They'd see through him in an instant, his shaking hands, his unsteady breath, the scene that screamed of something more than an accident. Fear overpowered reason, and instead of reaching for the phone to confess, he chose a different path. He decided to cover it up, to bend the truth into something he could survive. He moved quickly, his actions driven by instinct rather than a clear plan. He grabbed a dish rag from the sink, its faded checkered pattern damp from earlier use, and dropped to his knees beside her. He wiped at the blood on the floor, smearing it at first before scrubbing harder, the rag growing heavy and stained as it soaked up the evidence. His breaths came in short, ragged gasps, the metallic scent of blood mixing with the stale air of the kitchen. He paused to steady himself, his eyes darting to Loretta's body, then forced himself to keep going. When the floor was as clean as he could manage, he turned his attention to her position. She looked too deliberate, too posed in her collapse, so he shifted her carefully. He slid her arm out from under her torso, adjusted her legs to mimic a natural fall, and tilted her head slightly as if she'd simply slipped and struck the table on her way down. The scene still felt incomplete, too sterile for a convincing accident. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on a glass sitting on the counter, half full of water from earlier. He snatched it up, his grip tight, and hurled it to the floor near her feet. The shatter was loud, jarring in the quiet house, and shards skittered across the tiles, glinting in the faint light from the living room lamp. It looked plausible now, a stumble, a spilled drink, a tragic misstep. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants, his pulse hammering in his ears as he surveyed his work. The kitchen bore the marks of a hurried lie, but he convinced himself it might hold, at least long enough to buy him time. He reached for the phone on the wall, its cord dangling in a loose coil, and dialed 911. As the line rang, he willed his voice to crack, his breathing to hitch, summoning the panic he needed to sell the story. When the operator answered, he stumbled through an explanation. His wife had fallen, she wasn't moving, he didn't know what happened, his words tumbling out in a rush of feigned desperation. He paced the small space as he spoke, his eyes flicking to Loretta's body, the glass, the rag he'd shoved under the sink. The operator's calm instructions barely registered. He muttered agreements, promises to stay on the line, but his focus was elsewhere, on the fragile illusion he'd crafted. The wail of sirens cut through the night minutes later, growing louder as red and blue lights flashed through the windows, painting the walls in erratic streaks. 2 paramedics burst through the front door, their boots heavy on the hardwood, their faces set with the urgency of their trade. Edward stepped aside, gesturing toward the kitchen with a trembling hand, his throat tight as he watched them kneel beside Loretta. They checked her pulse, shone a light into her unblinking eyes, their movements swift and practiced. One of them pressed fingers to her wrist, then her neck, his brow furrowing as he found no sign of life. The other tilted her head gently, examining the wound, and paused. He noticed the bruises blooming on her arms, dark, finger-shaped marks that hadn't been there that morning, and the unnatural twist of her neck, too severe for a simple fall. The paramedics exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. One reached for his radio, his voice low as he called it in, requesting police assistance. Edward hovered near the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets to hide their shaking, his stomach churning as the weight of their scrutiny settled over him. The medics continued their assessment, their hands careful but probing, and with each passing second, Edward felt the threads of his deception unraveling. The bruises, the angle of her body, the faint smear of blood he'd missed on the table's edge, they were clues he couldn't erase, signs that pointed to a truth he couldn't outrun. The sirens had faded, but a new sound rose in their place, the distant rumble of police cars closing in, tightening the net around him with every turn of their wheels. The police arrived within an hour, their cruiser pulling up to the curb with a quiet crunch of gravel under the tires. 2 detectives from the Tampa Police Department stepped out, their figures silhouetted against the flashing lights that still pulsed from the paramedics' ambulance. They were seasoned investigators, their eyes sharp and their movements deliberate, honed by years of sifting through the wreckage of human mistakes. The night air hung heavy with moisture, the kind of sticky warmth that Florida summers never relinquished, even after dark. As they crossed the threshold into the house, their shirts darkened with sweat, clinging to their backs as they took in the scene. They moved into the kitchen, where Loretta's body still lay, now cordoned off by the paramedics who lingered nearby, their faces grim. The detectives began their work methodically, their gazes sweeping over the room with practiced precision. One crouched near the body, his flashlight tracing the contours of Loretta's form, noting the awkward angle of her head and the bruises that marred her arms. The other circled the space, his steps slow and measured, his attention drawn to the counter, the sink, the trash bin tucked against the wall. He nudged the bin's lid open with a gloved hand and froze. Inside, buried beneath a crumpled paper towel, sat the blood-soaked rag Edward had used to wipe the floor. The faint metallic scent rose to meet him, unmistakable even in the humid air. He pulled it free, holding it up to the light, the stained fabric a silent accusation that contradicted the story Edward had spun. Edward stood in the living room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his breath shallow as he watched the detectives at work. Their presence unnerved him, their silence more damning than any question. When they approached him, their expressions unreadable, he stuck to his account. Loretta had tripped, fallen, hit her head, a tragic accident he couldn't prevent. But the detectives weren't convinced. The rag, the body's position, the glass shards that seemed too conveniently scattered, they didn't align with a simple mishap. They escorted him to their car, the cuffs clicking around his wrists with a cold finality, and drove him to the station. In the interrogation room, a stark box of concrete and flickering fluorescent lights, Edward sat across from them, his hands clasped on the table, his posture rigid with forced confidence. He repeated his tale, his voice steady at first, each word carefully placed to shield him from the truth. The autopsy came the next morning, conducted in a sterile room at the county morgue while the sun climbed over Tampa's skyline. The medical examiner worked with clinical efficiency, his tools glinting under the harsh lights as he examined Loretta's remains. The findings unraveled Edward's fragile narrative in an instant. She hadn't died from the blow to her head, as he'd claimed. The table's edge had left a mark, yes, but the real cause lay deeper, a fracture in her cervical vertebrae, snapped under intense pressure, not a fall. Bruises encircled her neck, faint but distinct, their pattern suggesting hands that had gripped and held, cutting off her air until her body gave out. The report landed on the detectives' desks by noon, its pages a stark map of violence that no accident could explain. Back at the station, the detectives confronted Edward with the evidence. They laid the autopsy photos before him, Loretta's pale face, the purpled marks on her throat, the blood matted in her hair, each image a hammer blow to his defenses. They pressed him, their questions methodical, peeling back the layers of his story with relentless calm. Edward's resolve wavered, his fingers twitching against the table, his eyes darting to the pictures he couldn't bear to face. The weight of the truth bore down on him, crushing the lies he'd clung to. He broke, his shoulders slumping, his breath escaping in a shuddering rush. He admitted to the argument, the surge of anger, the moment he'd pushed her, harder than he'd meant, he insisted, watching her fall. He swore he hadn't intended to kill her, that it was a mistake born of rage, but the words rang hollow against the bruises that told a different story. Word spread quickly through the church, a ripple of shock that swelled into chaos by evening. The congregation gathered in whispered clusters, their faith shaken as the news filtered out. Pastor Edward, their shepherd, had taken his wife's life. The sanctuary, once a place of solace, buzzed with disbelief and grief, its stained glass windows casting muted colors over pews that felt emptier now. The elders met in hushed urgency, their voices low as they grappled with the betrayal of a man they'd trusted. Loretta's children, scattered across the state, received the calls one by one, first the police, then friends, then the fractured accounts of parishioners. They turned away from their father, their silence a wall he couldn't breach, their refusal to speak to him a judgment sharper than any court's. Edward sat alone in a holding cell, the clang of the door echoing in his ears, the reality of his unraveling world closing in like the humid night outside. By September 2015, Edward Jackson stood before the judge in the Hillsborough County Courthouse in Tampa, a cavernous room with high ceilings and polished wooden benches that creaked under the weight of its occupants. The trial had drawn a crowd that spilled into the aisles, church members who once sat under his sermons, reporters scribbling notes for the evening papers, and locals who'd come for the spectacle of a fallen pastor. The air hung heavy with the scent of old wood and the faint hum of a struggling air conditioner, unable to fully combat the lingering heat of late summer. Edward's once imposing frame, draped for years in the flowing robes of his calling, was now swallowed by the loose fit of an orange jumpsuit, its bright fabric a stark contrast to the muted tones of the courtroom. His hands, cuffed in front of him, rested limply as he faced the bench, his eyes fixed on the floor. The proceedings unfolded over days, a slow unraveling of evidence and testimony that left little room for doubt. The prosecution laid out the autopsy findings, the detectives recounted their discoveries, and the paramedics described the scene they'd walked into that night. Edward's defense offered a plea of passion, a momentary lapse, but the bruises on Loretta's neck and the fracture in her spine painted a picture too deliberate to dismiss. When the judge delivered the verdict, 20 years in prison for manslaughter with aggravating circumstances, his gavel struck with a finality that echoed through the room. Edward didn't flinch, his face a mask of resignation, though his shoulders sagged as the bailiff led him away, the chains clinking softly with each step. The church felt the loss like a wound torn open. Without Edward, the pulpit stood empty, its authority diminished by the stain of his actions. The choir, once Loretta's pride, fell silent, its members too shaken to lift their voices in song. Sunday services dwindled, the congregation fracturing as some drifted to other churches and others simply stayed home, unable to reconcile their faith with the man they'd followed. The elders scrambled to appoint an interim leader, but the momentum of 18 years slipped through their fingers, leaving the sanctuary a hollow shell of its former self. The house by the bay, with its view of the water and its magnolia-scented porch, went up for sale within weeks. Strangers walked its floors, peering into closets and testing faucets, while the memories of Loretta's preserves and Edward's late-night sermon prep faded into the walls. Loretta's children made their own exodus from Florida, each packing up their lives with a quiet determination to distance themselves from the wreckage. The eldest drove north to Georgia, the middle child west to Texas, and the youngest south to Miami, scattering like seeds caught in a storm. They didn't visit Edward, didn't call, didn't write. Their silence was a severance he felt more keenly than the bars of his cell, a rejection that carved out a hollow space in his chest. The family name, once spoken with respect in Tampa's tight-knit circles, became a whisper of scandal, a burden they refused to carry. They left behind the humid shores of the Gulf, the church bulletins still listing their parents' names, and the town that wouldn't let the story die. Edward found himself in a cell at the state prison, a narrow rectangle of concrete and steel where the air smelled of sweat and bleach. He sat on the thin mattress, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the gray wall as the days blurred into one another. His mind turned over the pieces of his downfall, those rumors about Cheryl that had haunted his marriage, the jealousy that had festered in his gut, the flash of rage that had undone everything. He replayed the nights he'd spent with the widow, brief moments of weakness he'd justified as harmless, and wondered if they'd somehow led to the condom that shattered his world. But Loretta had taken that answer with her, burying it in the silence of her grave, leaving him with a question that gnawed at him in the quiet hours. He'd never know the truth, and that uncertainty became a companion as constant as the clang of the cell block doors. Tampa settled back into its rhythms, the heat of summer giving way to the milder days of fall, though the humidity lingered like a memory. The story of the pastor who killed his wife didn't fade easily. It lingered on porches and in diners, recounted over iced tea and cigarettes as the sun dipped low over the bay. Locals leaned close, their voices hushed, piecing together the tale, the argument, the fall, the trial, each telling adding a layer of myth to the facts. Edward's name became a cautionary thread woven into the town's fabric, a reminder of how quickly grace could turn to ruin. The house sold to a young couple from out of state, the church found a new pastor, and life moved on, but the echo of that sweltering July night hung in the air, a ghost that Tampa couldn't quite shake.